There are nights that history chooses to forget, nights too heavy with silence to be written, nights when the Empire's brightest jewels became prisoners inside their own beauty. It begins inside the heart of Topkapi Palace, where the scent of amber and rosewater lingers above polished marble floors, and the sound of a distant fountain masks the muffled weeping of a young girl. She is a princess, daughter of the world's most powerful sovereign, raised in rooms gilded with verses from the Quran, and guarded by men who were forbidden to touch or even dream. The Empire taught her that obedience is purity, that silence is grace, that love is irrelevant. But tonight, beneath the dim light of an oil lamp and the rustle of silk curtains, she will learn what it means to belong, not to God, not to herself, but to power. Outside her chamber door stands the man chosen for her, a stranger twice her age, his hands trembling not from passion but from duty. The air between them is thick with incense and fear, as if even the walls know what is about to happen must never be spoken of. Eunuchs guard the corridor, their eyes fixed on the floor, while servants whisper prayers under their breath, pretending not to hear what no one should hear. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the call to prayer fades into the night, and the world carries on as though nothing sacred has just been broken. They called it marriage, she called it the end of her freedom, and as the veil falls from her face, the Empire closes its eyes. For 600 years, history told the story of Ottoman glory, but never the story of its daughters. Tonight, that silence ends. If you want to uncover the secrets that the Empire buried beneath gold and blood, subscribe, because what you're about to hear was never meant to be remembered. She, the imperial harem of Topkapi, was a world built on contradictions, a paradise constructed to resemble a cage. From the outer courtyards of the palace, it appeared like heaven carved into stone, mosaics glinting beneath the sunlight, gardens perfumed with jasmine, and slender domes rising above the Bosphorus, as if even the sea bowed to the Sultan's will. Yet, beyond those gilded doors, behind the latticework screens that shimmered like gold-dusted spiderwebs, lived women who were never free to see the sky without permission. Every step they took was measured by custom, every breath by rank. For the princesses, the blood daughters of the Sultan, this captivity began not with chains, but with silk. From birth, they were swaddled in brocade, guarded by silence, and trained to embody perfection so flawless it became another kind of imprisonment. They were taught that their smiles could be weapons, their obedience a form of survival, and that their bodies were extensions of imperial diplomacy. In their world, beauty was both armor and sentence, and innocence the first sacrifice demanded by empire. In the mornings, they woke to the murmurs of attendants preparing incense and sherbet, while the eunuchs, solemn, ghost-like figures, patrolled the corridors with the soundless grace of shadows. The princesses' chambers were filled with treasures from conquered lands, Persian carpets woven with prayers, Venetian mirrors that reflected faces too pale from confinement, silver cages with songbirds whose wings had forgotten what wind felt like. The irony of their lives was almost cruelly poetic. Surrounded by luxury, they were forbidden to desire anything beyond it. They lived under the watchful eye of the Valid Sultan, their grandmother or mother, who reigned as the true matriarch of this enclosed universe. The Valid ruled not with affection but with calculation. She understood that every emotion in the harem was a form of currency, and that love, when given freely, was a liability. So the girls were taught early to restrain their hearts, to fold their dreams like letters never sent, and to wear composure as tightly as the jewels clasped around their throats. There were lessons beyond the embroidery frames and music chambers, lessons of posture, restraint, and silence. The tutors, imported from across the empire, instructed them in poetry, languages, and philosophy, but always within boundaries that reminded them that knowledge was dangerous when it inspired independence. Even the songs sung to them as children were coded in obedience. One line of a palace lullaby whispered, "Do not love the moon, for she disappears each night. Love the palace, for it never leaves you." Beneath such beauty, there was a quiet violence, not of swords or whips, but of control so complete that rebellion became unthinkable. The women of the harem learned to smile as their world grew smaller, to dance before foreign guests like visions of serenity, and to carry their fear in silence because silence was dignity. Yet behind every smile lingered the same unspoken truth. They were pawns in a game played by men who would never understand the cost of the power they held. Occasionally, the sound of cannon fire echoed from the city beyond, marking a victory or the birth of a prince. The princesses would stand by the lattice windows and listen, wondering how many men had died for the joy of their father's empire. Their lives were tied to that distant bloodshed, even if they never saw it. The soldiers fought for glory, the princesses endured for the continuation of dynasty. And in that symmetry of sacrifice, their suffering became invisible, too sacred to acknowledge, too shameful to reveal. Even the chroniclers of the empire, who recorded every feast and campaign, omitted the private lives of the sultan's daughters. What could they have written? That the most powerful women in the empire could not choose whom to love, when to marry, or even when to speak. That within the marble walls of Topkapi, the daughters of kings lived with less freedom than the merchants' wives who walked the markets below. At night, when the oil lamps burned low and the corridors fell into hush, the princesses would gather in secret to whisper dreams. They spoke of stars they had never seen clearly through the lattice, of seas they had only smelled from afar, of poems they would never be allowed to write. One might speak of a eunuch who treated her kindly, another of a rumor that one princess, long dead, had escaped the palace disguised as a servant and vanished into the city. Such stories were blasphemous but necessary, small rebellions that gave shape to hope. Hope was the only contraband allowed in the harem, passed like a candle between trembling hands. Yet hope, too, could be dangerous. For each girl who dared to imagine freedom, there were others who reminded her that every escape was punished by erasure. Her name struck from the records, her existence rewritten as madness or death. The empire did not kill its daughters, it simply erased them. Sometimes, the sultan himself would visit the harem not as a father, but as an emperor inspecting his possessions. His arrival was preceded by silence. Servants kneeling, eunuchs clearing the halls, the valid straightening her veil. The princesses would lower their eyes as he entered, for even the act of looking upon the sultan too boldly was considered a challenge to divine order. He would speak few words, offer gifts, inquire about their studies or health, and then depart with the weight of an empire still clinging to his robes. The moment he left, the silence that followed was not relief but a reminder that their lives, their marriages, their very destinies would be decided in rooms they were forbidden to enter. The sultan's will was law, and law needed no explanation. To be born royal was to be born owned. And yet, amid all this control, there were moments when humanity broke through, fleeting and fragile. A princess might sneak a glance at the courtyard where the servants laughed, envy sparking behind her painted calm. Another might linger by the aviary, whispering to a caged nightingale as though the bird could carry her soul beyond the Bosphorus. Some even fell in love with the very men forbidden to touch them, eunuchs, tutors, guards, men who existed in their world as shadows, not equals. Those forbidden emotions became poetry and secret journals, written in invisible ink and hidden beneath floor tiles or behind wall tapestries. Centuries later, historians would find fragments of those writings, verses filled with longing and despair, metaphors of locked gardens and wingless birds, their authors unnamed but unmistakably royal. They reveal that within the gilded silence of the harem, art became a cry, beautiful enough to survive censorship, tragic enough to define it. The gilded prison was not built of walls, but of expectations. It was made of prayers that disguised control, of luxury that camouflaged sorrow, of titles that rendered women invisible beneath their own splendor. To the outside world, these princesses were the embodiment of divine grace, symbols of Ottoman majesty. To themselves, they were echoes in corridors that never forgot their footsteps. And when the time came for them to leave, carried in carriages draped in gold, veiled for marriages they did not desire, they looked back at Topkapi not with love, but with a strange ache of nostalgia. The prison they left was the only world they had ever known. Outside those gates waited a new kind of captivity, wrapped in wedding silks and sealed with vows written in fear. For every princess who smiled in the portraits of history, there was a girl beneath the paint who once stood by a window, staring at the sea she could never touch, wondering whether the empire that claimed to protect her had already devoured her soul. There is no word in the Ottoman language that fully captures what the princess felt when the decree was read aloud. Marriage was a term wrapped in silk, perfumed with promise. Yet when spoken in the palace, it sounded more like an order disguised as destiny. The announcement came not in the warmth of her mother's arms, but in the presence of court scribes and chamberlains, who recited her fate with the same tone used to announce a new law or a tax increase. She was to be wed to a pasha of distant lands, a man older than her father had been when he conquered his first province. His name meant nothing to her. What mattered was his rank, high enough to serve the Sultan, yet low enough to be reminded of his dependence on the throne. The princess's hand was not a token of affection, but a seal of loyalty, a binding gesture meant to keep ambitious men tethered to the dynasty. Her body was the parchment upon which politics was written, her youth the ink that would fade as soon as the empire required another treaty. The days leading to the ceremony unfolded like a ritual of surrender. Seamstresses and servants busied themselves with fabrics imported from Persia and Venice, stitching gowns that shimmered under lamplight, as if beauty could erase dread. The palace hummed with preparation. Musicians rehearsed hymns of joy that no one truly felt. Cooks prepared banquets for guests who cared more for spectacle than sentiment, and scribes drafted proclamations that would be sent across the empire, announcing yet another divine union. The princess, meanwhile, moved through these rehearsals like a ghost inhabiting her own story. She was measured, perfumed, instructed on how to bow, how to smile, how to conceal trembling behind grace. The Valid Sultan, veiled in authority, reminded her that her duty was not to love, but to represent, not to desire, but to endure. She would carry the empire's dignity in her silence. And when the young woman dared to ask if she could at least meet the man she was to call husband, the Valid's answer was soft but final. A princess does not meet, she is presented. The day of the wedding arrived beneath skies too blue to be merciful. Drums echoed across Istanbul as carriages rolled through the palace gates, their wheels scattering rose petals on the marble steps. The air was thick with incense and politics. Envoys, pashas, scholars, and poets gathered in jeweled robes, each pretending to witness love when in truth they were witnessing power arrange itself into a new form. The bride emerged from the palace draped in layers of silk heavy enough to slow her steps. Her face was hidden behind a thin gold veil that shimmered like sunlight through tears. As she walked, the court women whispered prayers, some out of envy, others out of pity. To marry was to leave the only home she had ever known, to exchange one gilded cage for another. Her dowry was immense: jewels, slaves, manuscripts, and carpets. Not because she was loved, but because she was valuable. The empire paid well for obedience. The groom waited in a distant hall, adorned with gifts from the Sultan, his face carved into an expression of duty. He had seen the princess only once, from afar, and that brief glimpse was enough to convince him that she was less a woman than a symbol. When they finally stood side by side before the imperial cleric, neither spoke. Their vows were recited for them, their hands joined by others. The witnesses smiled and applauded as if love itself had been witnessed. In reality, two strangers had been bound by decree, their union consecrated by fear rather than affection. When the ceremony ended, cannon fire thundered across the city, proclaiming joy to the world beyond the palace walls. The people cheered in the streets, believing the princess had found happiness. They could not know that inside her heart something sacred had been buried beneath the weight of duty. That night, when the palace lamps dimmed and the revelers dispersed, she was led to her new chambers, vast, silent, perfumed with jasmine and musk. The eunuchs withdrew without a word, closing the doors behind them. The groom entered hesitantly, his steps echoing against marble floors that had seen too many such nights. There was no tenderness in their meeting, only formality, as though they were enacting a play both had memorized, but neither wished to perform. He bowed, murmured a prayer for guidance, and looked at her through the veil that still concealed her eyes. For a moment, he seemed almost human, weary, unsure, aware that the girl before him had been sacrificed to confirm his loyalty. But the empire demanded proof of consummation, and proof left no room for mercy. Outside, musicians played to drown out what must not be heard. The palace slept beneath a blanket of celebration, and within that silence, a life was rewritten. When morning came, attendants entered quietly. They changed the sheets, replaced the incense, and left offerings of fruit and wine beside the untouched pillows. The bride sat motionless, her face pale, her hands cold, her gaze distant. She had not cried, for tears were considered weakness unbecoming of a royal woman. She had learned her lesson well, that pain, when endured without complaint, could be mistaken for virtue. Later, the Sultan sent a messenger bearing gifts, a pearl necklace, a set of golden bracelets, and a message written in calligraphy so elegant it almost disguised its cruelty. "May your obedience be rewarded." It was the only blessing she would ever receive. Her departure from Topkapi was announced as a triumph. The procession stretched for miles, guards on horseback, banners fluttering, gifts piled high. The city gathered to watch, unaware that they were witnessing an exile disguised as honor. The princess looked out from her carriage window, seeing for the first time the faces of common women who walked freely through the streets, their laughter unguarded, their eyes unshadowed by duty. In that instant, she understood the full scope of her captivity. Freedom was not the absence of walls, it was the right to choose what those walls contained, and that right had never belonged to her. In the distant province where she would now live, her new household awaited, servants trained to obey her, advisors appointed to report on her, courtiers eager to interpret her every word as a reflection of imperial favor. She was a wife now, but in truth, she remained a vessel of the Sultan's will, her existence a constant reminder that no one, not even blood of the empire's founder, could belong to themselves. At banquets, her husband would boast of their union, lifting his cup to the glory of the dynasty, while she sat beside him, smiling the same rehearsed smile that every princess before her had worn. In the eyes of the court, she was blessed. In the silence of her chambers, she was erased. Thus, the marriage that was never hers became the pattern for generations to come. Alliances sealed in fear, daughters sacrificed for stability, love traded for loyalty. The empire called it order, historians called it custom, but the women who lived it had no word for what it truly was. It was the slow unmaking of the self beneath layers of silk and ceremony, the quiet erasure of desire beneath the weight of duty. And though the chronicles would never record their cries, their ghosts lingered in the corridors of Topkapi, whispering to the moon that still rose above the Bosphorus. A moon that had seen everything, remembered everything, and wept for what it could not change. The night of the wedding was not an event. It was an ordeal written into the secret architecture of empire. In the Ottoman court, the first night between a princess and her assigned husband was treated less as an act of intimacy and more as a ritual of proof, an unwritten law older than any decree, older even than the empire itself. The harem called it Gci Imtihan, the night of testing, though no one dared speak the name aloud. The ritual existed in shadows, passed down by women who had endured it before, remembered not through words, but through glances and gestures, through the way a hand trembled when it touched a veil, or a voice broke when it recited a blessing. This was the night every princess dreaded since childhood, the night her body would cease to be her own. And though the empire surrounded her with luxury, the deeper purpose of that opulence was not comfort. It was concealment, a veil drawn over the truth that what was about to happen was not divine, not romantic, but ritualized obedience in its purest form. As the evening fell, the palace seemed to exhale in preparation. Attendants bathed the princess in rose water scented with musk and sandalwood, each gesture deliberate, each motion a prayer for endurance disguised as celebration. Her hair was combed until it shone like dark silk, her skin dusted with gold powder, her eyelids painted with crushed lapis, her lips tinted with the faint red of pomegranate. Around her neck hung a thin chain of pearls, not for adornment, but for symbolism. Each pearl represented purity, and by morning, that chain would mark whether she remained within the empire's expectations or fell beneath its shame. The women who prepared her avoided her eyes. They spoke only in blessings that sounded more like warnings. One whispered, "May Allah grant you patience." Another, older and softer, said what the others would not, "May He forgive us all." The chamber prepared for her was not her own. It was arranged according to the codes of the palace, with carpets from Persia and cushions embroidered with verses of divine love, as though beauty could sanctify fear. Lamps glowed in every corner, casting light that felt too gentle for what it illuminated. Outside the door, eunuchs stood like carved idols, their silence thicker than the air. Musicians began to play in the distant courtyard, flutes and tambourines weaving melodies meant to mask the sounds from within. The empire had perfected the art of silencing women even through music. It was said that if the night passed quietly, the empire would prosper. If cries were heard, they were written off as ill omens to be banished with incense by morning. In truth, it was not the cries that cursed the palace, it was the system that required them. The groom arrived when the final call to prayer echoed from the minarets. He entered not as a lover, but as an emissary of the Sultan's will. His eyes met hers only briefly, and in that glance lay the full tragedy of their shared bondage. Though he held power over her, he too was enslaved to the empire's expectations, a man required to prove his loyalty through the possession of another human being. Between them stood centuries of protocol, the ghost of a throne, and the invisible hand of history dictating what must occur. He recited a short prayer, not of love but of submission. In the name of God, who grants dominion and takes it away. And then, beneath the glow of lamplight and the hush of 100 unseen witnesses, the ritual began. A ceremony so carefully choreographed that even despair had a script. It was never about passion, nor even about the man himself. The ritual was a performance, a formality that ensured the Sultan's bloodline remained sacred, untarnished, unchallenged. The consummation was proof of obedience, a signature made with flesh instead of ink. The sheets, inspected at dawn, would bear the marks of her transformation from princess to consort, from daughter to property. Servants would whisper of it in metaphors. The rose has opened, they would say, and the empire blooms anew. Yet for the princess, it was a night of erasure. Her laughter, her prayers, her memories of childhood all absorbed into the walls that had heard too many such silences. When it was done, the man who was called her husband turned away, muttering a prayer of thanks not to her but to the empire that had ordained his triumph. The lamps flickered, and the faint smoke of burnt myrrh curled toward the ceiling like the souls of forgotten brides. By morning, the ceremony of confirmation began. The attendants entered with lowered eyes, carrying trays of rose petals and silver basins of water. The room reeked of incense and expectation. The Valid Sultan's envoys arrived to ensure the ritual's completion, their expressions neither cruel nor kind, merely administrative. The blood-stained sheet was presented, folded with reverence, as if it were a holy relic. It would be sent to the archives of the palace, sealed in a chest with others like it, proof of purity turned into property records. Historians would later deny these rituals ever existed, yet the archives whispered otherwise. Beneath centuries of dust, in forgotten storerooms of Topkapi, such evidence would surface. Quiet, unspoken confirmation of what power had long chosen to forget. The princess was bathed again, dressed in a new robe of crimson and gold, her hair bound in a style reserved for married women. She sat before a mirror that reflected not her face, but her new identity, an ornament in the empire's endless theater. For the next 3 days, celebration masked mourning, banquets were held, poets recited verses praising divine love, and messengers carried news of the royal union to distant provinces. The people rejoiced, believing the princess had found bliss. Yet within the palace, the women who had served before her moved more quietly, their eyes avoiding hers, their steps slower. They knew that the wedding night was not an ending but a beginning, the beginning of obedience that would stretch across years, a chain that could never be broken. The princess, now veiled in the dignity of marriage, understood that she had not become a queen, but an instrument. Her every word would now be interpreted as an extension of her husband's authority, her every gesture measured by what it said about the Sultan's grace. Even her silence became a form of politics, and so the ritual achieved its purpose. It turned human beings into symbols, emotion into ceremony, love into hierarchy. The princess's fear became the empire's stability. Her humiliation was translated into strength for those who ruled. Her silence was sanctified, her pain recorded not in chronicles but in the marble floors that remembered her footsteps. Centuries later, when scholars studied the harem, they spoke of architecture and politics, of beauty and influence, but rarely of that one night that turned women into myths. They forgot that behind the gold and perfume, beneath the prayers and poetry, there were hearts that broke so quietly that even history mistook it for decorum. For 600 years, the Ottoman court celebrated the grandeur of its lineage, the wisdom of its rulers, the glory of its cities. Yet within those same walls, night after night, the ritual continued. Perfumed, disciplined, denied. Each princess became a verse in the same tragic poem, each veil a repetition of the same silence. And when dawn came, as it always did, the empire woke to another morning of triumph, while its daughters carried the weight of its unspoken sins. Thus the harem remained immaculate in record, unblemished in legend, holy in the eyes of history. Because the screams had been replaced with music and the truth had been replaced with ritual. The empire was not held together by armies alone, nor by the fear of the Sultan's wrath, nor even by the faith that bound its millions to a single crescent moon. Beneath the visible machinery of conquest and law, there existed another, quieter structure, an empire built on obedience, refined through centuries of silence. Every marriage arranged within the palace, every veil lowered before a stranger, every whispered ritual of submission within the harem was not simply private tragedy, it was political architecture. The princesses, though gilded and revered, were the threads that stitched the empire together, linking distant provinces and powerful men to the throne with bonds stronger than loyalty. Bonds made of blood and silence. The Sultan's daughters were the empire's most sacred instruments, their obedience serving as the ultimate symbol of imperial discipline. To control them was to control the empire itself, for as long as they remained loyal, so too did the men who claimed them. In the long corridors of Topkapi, obedience was treated not as a choice, but as a virtue that defined civilization. The harem was a microcosm of the empire, a carefully calibrated hierarchy where every rank, every gesture, every silence reinforced the idea that harmony could only exist through submission. The Sultan was the sun around which all life revolved, and every woman within those walls was a reflection of his divine order. To defy that order was to threaten the cosmos itself. Even the poets of the court, those whose pens danced closest to blasphemy, dared only to hint at this truth through metaphor. They wrote of roses that bloomed only when commanded by the sun, of rivers that dared not flow unless the moon permitted it, of stars that vanished when they forgot their place. What they could not write, but every soul within the palace knew, was that such beauty came at a cost. The crushing of countless wills, the silencing of countless voices. Beyond the palace walls, the empire mirrored this same rhythm of obedience. Governors and viziers who rose to power through the favor of royal marriages understood that their fortunes depended on the princesses they married. The Sultan, by binding his daughters to them, ensured that love was replaced by surveillance, passion by politics. A man might command an army, yet he would tremble before his wife's letters, for each line written in her hand was a reminder that the throne was watching. The princess, adorned in jewels and silks, was both consort and spy, her presence in the provincial palace a living reminder that her husband's soul belonged not to himself, but to the empire. Thus, through the bodies of women, loyalty was manufactured, rebellion prevented, and ambition domesticated. The men who shared the princess's beds could never fully trust them, yet could never escape their influence. It was a masterpiece of control, invisible, intimate, and absolute. In time, this system of arranged obedience became so natural that even those within it forgot it was built on fear. The chronicles of the empire celebrated the peace that reigned under its discipline, the prosperity born of harmony between the Sultan and his subjects, never admitting that this harmony was forged from coerced devotion. The princesses themselves were immortalized in miniature paintings, serene faces framed by gold halos, eyes lowered in eternal grace. To the viewer, they appeared divine, untouched by sorrow, embodiments of order and faith. But if one looks closer, if one reads the diaries of foreign visitors who glimpsed them through veils or overheard their laughter behind screens, a different story emerges. Those smiles were masks, rehearsed and perfected through generations. Their stillness was not serenity but exhaustion. The painters were not preserving beauty, they were embalming obedience. The most tragic truth of this empire was that its greatness depended on making suffering invisible. The Sultan's authority was maintained through the illusion that all were content, that divine justice reigned unbroken from the palace to the provinces. Yet the closer one looks, the more one sees how obedience infected every relationship, between ruler and subject, husband and wife, parent and child. Fear was rebranded as faith, control reimagined as piety. The same prayers that blessed the battlefield also sanctified the wedding bed. In the sermons of court imams, submission was exalted as the highest form of devotion, and the harem was described not as captivity, but as paradise. The princesses were praised as models of virtue, their silence proof of moral perfection. And so the empire survived, century after century, feeding upon the virtue it demanded, confusing holiness with quiet despair. Yet history has a strange way of recording what it tries hardest to erase. In the margins of forgotten manuscripts, In the footnotes of foreign accounts, in the songs of servants and eunuchs who outlived their masters, the cracks begin to appear. There were whispers of princesses who defied the ritual, who refused to obey, whose rebellion was punished with exile or disappearance. One tale tells of a young woman, the daughter of a late sultan, who, upon learning of her arranged marriage, locked herself in her chamber and burned her wedding garments. For 3 days she neither ate nor spoke. When the doors were finally opened, she had written across her walls in ink and blood, "I was born to an empire, not to a man." Her name was struck from all official records, her existence erased from the family tree. Yet her words survived, etched into rumor, passed from maid to maid as a secret prayer for courage. Even in silence, resistance persisted, not loud enough to change the empire, but strong enough to haunt it. By the 17th century, the empire had begun to rot beneath the weight of its own obedience. The same discipline that once ensured stability now suffocated innovation. The same reverence for hierarchy that had held the empire together now prevented it from breathing. While Europe redefined itself through rebellion and reason, the Ottomans tightened their grip on tradition, mistaking stillness for strength. Within the harem, the princesses continued to play their roles, but their eyes turned inward. Some became patrons of art and architecture, using the wealth of their dowries to build mosques and schools, acts of quiet redemption disguised as piety. Others withdrew into mysticism, seeking in the verses of Rumi or the solitude of prayer the freedom their lives denied them. Their faith was no longer the empire's faith. It was something deeper, more desperate, a dialogue between captive souls and a silent God. Through them, the idea of obedience began to change. What had once been compulsion transformed, slowly and secretly, into endurance, a form of inner strength born of suffering. They learned to bend without breaking, to hide defiance within devotion, to make silence speak. The same rituals that had been used to control them became vehicles for subversion. A prayer recited for her husband could become, in her heart, a plea for deliverance. A poem praising the Sultan might hide lines of grief too subtle for men to read. The empire believed it had tamed its daughters, but in truth, it had created philosophers, women who understood the limits of power more profoundly than the men who ruled them. And though history never recorded their names, their influence endured in the unseen corners of the palace. In the compassion of a servant spared punishment, in the education of a child taught mercy over conquest, in the rare moments when the empire remembered that greatness built on obedience was no greatness at all. By the time the empire began to fade, its rituals remained unchanged, its veils still drawn, its daughters still presented as offerings to power. But within those silences, a revolution had already begun, not of swords or banners, but of memory. For every generation of women who suffered in silence, another learned to remember, to tell the story differently, to see the empire not as glory but as tragedy gilded in sunlight. And though the walls of Topkapi still gleam beneath the Turkish sky, their marble holds the echo of footsteps that once walked in measured grace, carrying secrets too heavy for one lifetime. The empire of obedience endured longer than its rulers, longer than its cities, longer even than its faith. But in the end, it was undone by the very silence that sustained it. For silence, once broken, cannot be rebuilt, and when history finally began to listen, the whisper of the princesses rose louder than the roar of any cannon. When empires die, they do not vanish, they retreat into silence. The Ottoman Empire, vast and relentless, carried its silence with it like a sacred relic, burying its sins beneath centuries of marble and prayer. The story of its princesses, their fear, their obedience, their ritualized suffering, was among the first truths to be sealed away. For 600 years, the empire mastered the art of forgetting, training generations of historians to praise what should have been questioned and to ignore what should have been mourned. Official chronicles spoke of glory, expansion, and divine order, but never of the women who wept behind embroidered screens. Their lives were edited out of history as neatly as their names were struck from family trees, their bodies transformed into metaphors of virtue, while their pain dissolved into myth. What survived of them was not their voices, but their portraits, serene, holy, voiceless. Yet even marble cannot hold silence forever, and every empire, no matter how vast, eventually faces the ghosts it tried to erase. It began with the discovery of letters, small, fragile documents unearthed from the archives of Topkapi centuries after the empire had fallen. The ink was faint, the paper brittle, but the words were unmistakably human. They spoke not of devotion, but of despair, not of loyalty, but of longing. Some were addressed to fathers who never replied, others to lovers who never existed, and a few to God himself, questioning why he had chosen silence as the language of fate. One letter, written in the delicate hand of a long-dead princess, contained a line that scholars would spend decades debating. If virtue is measured by silence, then hell must be the quietest place of all. Such words did not belong to the empire that claimed her. They belonged to the woman beneath the crown, the forgotten daughter who had lived and died beneath a ritual that worshipped her purity while consuming her will. These letters were dangerous because they transformed the sacred narrative of empire into something recognizably human, reminding the world that beneath every symbol of power lies the memory of someone who suffered for it. Modern historians, when they first encountered these fragments, treated them cautiously, as though handling forbidden scripture. The Ottoman archives, long guarded by bureaucracy and reverence, were reluctant to yield their ghosts. When translations began to surface, they were met with scandal. The notion that the empire's most revered women might have been victims, not saints, offended both pride and tradition. Nationalists dismissed the letters as forgeries, foreign propaganda meant to humiliate a glorious past. Religious scholars argued that such suffering was the natural price of divine order. And yet, the truth persisted, quiet but unyielding, like water carving its way through stone. Each recovered diary, each record of a silenced life, widened the crack in the empire's facade. It was as if the centuries themselves were confessing, piece by piece, that the perfection once worshipped in the harem had always been sustained by pain, too sacred to acknowledge. But perhaps the most haunting revelation was not found in words at all, but in the spaces where words should have been. Historians began to notice the patterns of omission, the pages deliberately removed, the names missing from genealogies, the sudden interruptions in otherwise meticulous records. The silences themselves told the story. When a princess disappeared from the archives, it was rarely because she had died of illness or old age. It was because she had broken the ritual, refused a marriage, questioned a decree, or dared to speak of what happened behind the golden doors. In the empire's logic, death was cleaner than disobedience, and erasure was more merciful than remembrance. What the sultan could not punish with sword or exile, the record keepers punished with invisibility. The result was a history polished to perfection, gleaming and hollow, where women existed only as reflections of male virtue. It would take the fall of the empire and the rise of modern curiosity for anyone to look behind that mirror and see the truth. The 20th century brought with it a new hunger for the forbidden past. Archaeologists, feminists, and poets began to dig where historians had refused to look. What they found was not just evidence of suffering, but evidence of strength, small acts of defiance that had survived beneath the weight of centuries. There were reports of princesses who smuggled letters to European ambassadors, of concubines who taught forbidden poetry to their servants, of women who secretly funded scholars and schools under their own names disguised as male donors. Their rebellion was not loud. It was luminous in its restraint. It thrived in the same silence that was meant to suppress it. The empire had tried to erase their voices, but in doing so, it inadvertently made them eternal. For every erased name, 1,000 speculations bloomed. For every burned letter, 1,000 interpretations rose. The very act of censorship became the evidence of truth. The rediscovery of these women's stories did more than rewrite history, it redefined it. The Ottoman Empire, once remembered only for its conquests and courts, began to appear as something else, a monument to controlled grace, a civilization that mistook obedience for order and beauty for peace. The princesses, long idealized as ornaments of divinity, emerged as its most tragic philosophers, women who understood the cost of empire not in theory but in flesh. Their silence had been political, their submission strategic. Even in captivity, they had found ways to assert control over what little remained theirs, their thoughts, their faith, their capacity to endure. In the modern world, they became symbols of something far greater than victimhood. They became the voices of resilience, of quiet rebellion, of the eternal human refusal to disappear completely. Still, the censorship did not end with the fall of the empire. In museums and textbooks, their lives are presented as curiosities, softened, sanitized, wrapped again in the same language of mystique and modesty that once confined them. Their names are recited in whispers, their pain repackaged as elegance. The harem is still described as an exotic paradise, its tragedies retold as romance. Even now, the veil of history remains, thinner perhaps, but still intact. To look through it requires courage. The courage to admit that behind every empire's perfection lies a scaffolding of silence built on human cost. The Ottomans were not unique in this, they were merely honest in their contradiction. They gave the world poetry and architecture, calligraphy and law, yet they also built their glory upon the unseen labor and suffering of those who could never speak of it. The censored truth of the princesses is not just Ottoman, it is universal. And so, the story returns to where it began. A chamber lit by oil lamps, a girl in silk trembling before a door she did not choose to open. Her name has been lost, her life reduced to a rumor in the archives, yet her presence lingers like the scent of rosewater on ancient marble. She represents every woman whose fate was decided by men who mistook obedience for order and silence for peace. The empire may have buried her story, but it could not bury its echo. It lives in the questions that haunt every historian who dares to read between the lines. How much truth can an empire afford to forget? How many silences must be broken before history becomes honest? The answers lie not in the chronicles of conquest, but in the letters, the prayers, and the sighs of the women who carried its weight in silence. When the gates of Topkapi close at dusk and the tourists drift away, the palace grows quiet again, as it once was. The marble halls shimmer with the last light of the sun, and the fountains murmur faintly as if remembering voices long gone. If one listens closely, the air itself seems to breathe, a slow, mournful rhythm, like the exhalation of centuries. That is not the wind moving through the courtyard. It is the sound of history, remembering what it tried to forget. For 600 years they called it duty. Now, at last, we can call it by its true name, tragedy.